Welcome back. Let's talk about Hilary Putnam and the invention of functionalism, a new theory about the nature of minds. I'm asking you to read Putnam's 1967 paper, The Nature of Mental States. But before you read the paper, I want to give you some guidance. The paper is divided into 5 sections, but there are really 2 that we want to focus on. Putnam begins the paper by telling us what he's not going to talk about. He says he's not going to talk about how we know about the mental states of ourselves or others, and he's not going to talk about the terms or concepts that we use to talk about mental states. He's only going to discuss the question, are pains brain states? Which of course is just his version of J.J.C. Smart's claim that sensations are brain processes. That's the topic. Having told us what he will and will not discuss, Putnam proceeds to spend 4.5 pages discussing a topic that he just said he would not discuss, namely the concepts and words that we use to think and talk about mental states. So we're going to skip ahead to section 2 titled, Is Pain a Brain State? Putnam tells us that he's going to advance his own theory of the nature of minds and argue that we should prefer it over the mind-brain identity theory, which he calls the brain state theory, and over behaviorism. In section 2, Putnam does 2 important things. First, Putnam tells us that he's not going to give us a conclusive deductive argument that the mind-brain identity theory and behaviorism are each false. That is, he's not going to try to convince us that no matter what, no matter how the world is, he's right. So in contrast to Smart, Putnam embraces the idea that he's putting forth a broadly empirical hypothesis that will be supported by the usual combination of evidence and theoretical considerations. Here, I'm not calling his hypothesis scientific because it's enough that Putnam is engaged in inquiry, and Putnam doesn't assume that there must be a bright line between science and other forms of inquiry like philosophy. Second, Putnam states his hypothesis by reference to something we already learned about, namely Turing machines. He begins with the idea that mental states are functional states of the whole organism. He writes, I shall, in short, argue that pain is not a brain state, in the sense of a physical chemical state of the brain or even the whole nervous system, but another kind of state entirely. I propose the hypothesis that pain, or the state of being in pain, is a functional state of the whole organism. This raises the question, what is a functional state of a whole organism? Putnam answers that question by reference to Turing machines. We're already familiar with Turing's model machine, the theoretical core of modern discrete state computing machines. Putnam reminds us that a Turing machine is deterministic in the sense that any given state of the machine determines all the subsequent states of the machine with probabilities of 0 or 1. The subsequent state will 100% happen at a time or 0% happen at a time. But once you have the idea of a Turing machine, you can recognize that such a machine is just one special case of what Putnam calls a probabilistic automaton, a machine that operates exactly like a Turing machine, except that it can have state transitions with probabilities other than 0 or 1. Using the idea of a probabilistic automaton, Putnam can restate his hypothesis. All organisms capable of having mental states are probabilistic automata, and mental states are the computational states of such probabilistic automata. More generally, as he said before, mental states are functional states of a whole organism. This is the core idea of Putnam's functionalism. Functionalism says roughly that mental states are computational states. Minds are like programs, that is, software, and brains are like computer hardware, the physical systems that implement or run the programs. According to functionalism, human minds are run, implemented, instantiated, or realized in human brains. Putnam doesn't do much more to elaborate the functionalist hypothesis in this paper because his main task is to critique competing theories, the mind-brain identity theory and behaviorism. Against behaviorism, in section 4, Putnam rehearses familiar critiques that behaviorism is trivial or fails to justify ordinary psychological explanations. But in section 3, Putnam advances a critique of the mind-brain identity theory that was so widely influential that for more than 30 years, most philosophers considered the identity theory to be completely dead. So you'll want to read section 3 very carefully. In sections 4 and 5, Putnam is just tying up some loose ends. The action is in section 3. Now is the time to read Putnam's paper and focus especially on section 3. Really.